Olá, pessoal. Bom dia a todos. Vou tirar aqui Eu vou abrir mão da nossa vinheta de entrada hoje, porque já estamos começando atrasado. Está tendo um probleminha aqui técnico, mas já está tudo resolvido. Então, bem-vindo todos aqui ao nosso curso de Neurociência Cognitiva, nosso curso internacional, e hoje mais internacional ainda, nosso convidado professor lá no Reino Unido, então eu não vou demorar muito aqui com as nossas observações para a gente poder logo dar andamento à nossa aula e não avançar no tempo. Então, o nosso convidado hoje, pessoal, ele fez PhD na Universidade de Cambridge, entre os anos de 91 e 94. Ele é neuropsicólogo, ele tem interesse na área de emoção e as consequências disso para a vida mental. Ele também é clínico, ele trabalha com pacientes que têm lesões neurológicas, especialmente aqueles que sofrem acidente vascular encefálico e trauma crânioencefálico. Os interesses de pesquisa do professor Oliver Turnbull é o aprendizado baseado na emoção, o papel da emoção em crenças, especialmente em pacientes neurológicos, a neurociência da psicoterapia, o manejo e o controle da emoção, que ele vai, inclusive, falar hoje sobre, que ele chama de regulação da emoção, e a memória emocional. O professor, ele é autor de mais de 200 publicações, ele é coautor de livros de divulgação científica, como O Cérebro e o Mundo Interno, e Os Enganos na Neuropsicologia Clínica. Então, pessoal, eu vou chamar aqui com a gente o professor Oliver Turnbull. A partir de agora eu vou falar em inglês, para o professor também poder entender o que eu estou falando, e aí ele vai dar a aula dele em inglês, e as perguntas, pessoal, que vocês quiserem fazer, podem colocar em português e a gente tenta traduzir para o professor Turnbull. Então, hello, Professor Turnbull.
Good morning, everybody.
Well, thank you again for coming for our meeting and to accept to give us a lecture. It's a really pleasure for our group to have you here to bring the best knowledge about the emotional basis, the neural basis for emotion. We really think about it. So, Professor, you can start your lecture. Let me share your presentation here. And then you just say next slide, and then I scroll for you the presentation, okay?
Perhaps you'll be able to see when the next slide is going to be anyway, but it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'll talk for about half an hour, maybe 40 minutes, I would guess. And then I'm happy to take any questions. Also, I have been told previously that sometimes I speak a little bit too fast for people who are not first language English speakers. So if you can let me know if I'm getting too enthusiastic and speaking too quickly, then just tell me, and I'll do my best to try and slow down. Is this right for you?
It's very good for us, your pronunciation, the speed of your talk, okay?
Okay, that's great. So let me open by trying to say a little bit about myself so you know who you're dealing with here. So the next slide, or the next few slides actually show you a bit more about who I am. If you can scroll those, there we go. I'm an academic in a little university town called Bangor in North Wales, where I am many things, including I'm the Deputy Vice Chancellor. I suppose you would call it the Vice President of the university. So I have a second job. A side hustle is what the Americans call it. So, but let's talk about my neuroscientific work. The next slide. There we go. I run an emotion and brain injury lab. My interest is acquired brain injury. And I do a little bit of clinical work for the North Wales Brain Injury Service. seeing patients who are mainly stroke under the age of 65 and head injury, particularly motor car accidents, for example, and things of that sort. The next slide should give you a feel. I'm also interested in neuroanatomy. I teach an annual summer school, which is a 1-week residential brain dissection course, which we will be running in 2 weeks' time, actually. Not only am I interested in anatomy, but I also paint brains. You can see, I think, behind me there on my wall are my selection of brains. So let's go to my next, the next picture, which is probably more of my brains. Next slide. Yes, there we go. So I teach anatomy through the medium of drawing and labeling, the traditional anatomical technique. So those are some examples of my artwork. Let's try our next slide. And I'm going to talk today about emotion and emotion regulation. Although I'm the person giving the talk, obviously there are collaborations with various people. The person on the left, Christian Salas, was my PhD student here many years ago, but he's now back in Santiago, Chile. The other two are clinicians and academics. On the next page, if you go to it, you will see some of my other collaborators. I think the next slide, sorry, if you didn't hear me there. Okay, including Mark Solms, who I'll talk a little bit about more later, who's quite well known in the area of neuropsychoanalysis, and I've published, a few books over the years with him. So shall we get going to the beginning of the talk now? You know who I am, and I'll say a bit more about emotion. So the next slide. I'd like to remind us all that emotion has had a very bad century. In the 20th century, particularly because of behaviorism, and in some respects, people who were denying the existence of mind. This is what I think is one of the strangest, or maybe the worst, quotes made by a psychologist in the entire 20th century, which is B.F. Skinner's attitude towards emotion, that emotions are excellent examples of the fictional causes to which we commonly attribute behavior. So if you are a Skinnerian, then you think that emotion doesn't exist. And if someone says to you that they're depressed or anxious, then they're just, I don't know how I would view it, that they're just pretending. This prejudice in the field has shaped the extent to which people do scientific work. And so almost all of the work in the field is in the area of cognition. In fact, I'm the department that I'm in a section called the Cognitive Neuroscience unit, even though I'm not interested in cognitive neuroscience. People are always hosting conferences on cognitive neuroscience, but I'm an affective neuroscientist. I'm interested in feelings. So here's a little paper we published nearly 10 years ago now, surveying a few books to see how much time was dedicated to emotion. And as you can see, 2% of this encyclopedia, Ramachandran's, dedicated to emotion, and 38% of it to cognition. So there are very few people interested in what I do, and therefore students often don't find out very much about the brain basis of emotion. So this is why it's a nice opportunity for me today to be able to help to shape that journey for you. So if we could go to the next slide. There are really 5 things that I'd like to talk about across the half an hour or so that we have. The brain basis of how we experience emotions, how we manage emotions, whether memory is important in relation to emotions, the role of emotion in delusional beliefs, false beliefs, and finally, I'll say a little bit about emotion in neurorehabilitation, because that's part of the clinical work that I do. So we'll go through each of those 5 sections systematically, and I'll show you some of my work and also other work in the field. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we'll have to go the slide beyond that, about the experience of basic emotions, and the idea that emotions are very old and that in brain terms, they are subcortical. That's the core finding. So the next slide. Okay, so if we'd been having this conversation 50 years ago in the 1970s or the 1980s about emotion and the brain, probably people would have emphasized hemispheric asymmetry. The fact that there is a literature suggesting that the right cerebral hemisphere is more involved in some things relating to emotion, like perceiving happy versus sad voices or recognizing happy versus sad faces. Those findings remain as true as they were 50 years ago. But what we've understood is that that is not the core experience of emotion. What I've just talked about, for example, recognizing a happy from a sad face, is a complex cognitive skill. You know, if it's the same face that differs only by some minor movements of the muscles of facial expression. And you need the cerebral cortex in order to do that. But that doesn't mean that the feeling of being happy or sad or angry is run by the cerebral cortex. I've shown in the slide here what I think it's a distinction between the cognitive aspects of emotion, the clever parts of emotion, and the visceral foundational experience of emotion, you know, what it feels like to be very anxious or very sad or indeed very angry. So let's see what we've learned in the last 50 years or so. Next slide, please. Here's a paper we published, I suppose, nearly a decade ago now, on the difference between the visceral experience of emotion and these cognitive skills. The graph you can see measures a group of people with some serious emotional challenges. They have been bereaved. They have what's usually called complicated grief. That is, they still remain, after 18 months or more, profoundly sad and in a period of mourning, and haven't been able to properly come to terms with the loss. Those are the people whose symptoms are expressed in the tall graphs, and the short graphs are people who also have lost family members, but who have been able to have a process of normal mourning in which they've slowly come to terms with their loss. So that if you measure any of those symptoms, and there are about 10 of them on that list there, you will see that these people in the clinical group are profoundly affected in terms of the experience of their lives. But the little quote I've got at the bottom of the slide here is about performance on an emotion face recognition task. So is the face happy, sad, or angry? And there's no difference between those groups there. So the problem that these profoundly sad people have, these bereaved people have, depressed people, has nothing to do with the cognitive aspects of emotion. It's not run by the cerebral cortex. And as you'll see, if you could go to the next slide, we'll be able to see the brain bases of those things. In fact, we've known about the brain bases of emotional experience sort of since the middle of the last century, the earliest work, but it didn't make it into cognitive neuroscience. It was done in animal work, some of it in the behaviorist tradition, or often by direct stimulation of the brain. You know, those famous experiments in which they stimulate the brains of usually rats and see how they behave. And they identified a small number of self-stimulation areas, as they're called. That's James Old's, the black and white picture, and his modern counterpart, the late great Jaak Panksepp, who was a good friend of mine. So they were able to find brain areas, the septal nuclei are the most famous of them all, which animals found enormously motivating. That is, they would choose stimulation of those brain areas over all sorts of other things that you think animals might prefer, like food, sexually receptive members of their species. They would cross electricity in order to get this. Female rats ignored their pups and instead preferred to have self-stimulation. You know, it's clearly this stimulation was more powerful than the things which we usually regard as important motivators or reinforcers, if you like that phrase. You know, we found the source here, or at least it suggests the source of these really very powerful feelings. So on the next slide, you'll see some other examples of more modern work. Of course, you might not believe me because I've just been talking about rats. So let's talk about people. There was some work done in the 1970s. I'm afraid not very ethical work, but that's another story. Stimulating those same septal nuclei in neurologically intact humans. And now, of course, because we are doing it with people instead of with rats, they can talk. And they describe how very pleasurable all of this is. They feel warm and alert, and they found the experience very enjoyable. And indeed, at the end of the session, when the experimenters are trying to pack the equipment away, the participant is complaining, saying, "Please, just let me have a little bit more of the good stuff. Just give me a few more minutes. It's so great." So clearly, those findings that we saw in rats are equally applicable. And of course, we'll talk about the conservation of old brain areas in a few minutes. So the other example I would choose is Helen Mayberg's work a couple of decades ago now for treatment-resistant depression, in which she has deep brain stimulation of the subgenual cingulate, so underneath the front end of the corpus callosum, in an area more or less next to the septal nuclei. These are patients who've been depressed for a very long time. They are not eligible for the treatment unless they have failed 4 different kinds of antidepressant approach: psychotherapy, pharmacotherapy, electroconvulsive therapy, everything you'd care to try, is not worked with these people. And in a subsection of that group, the transformation is instantaneous with the arrival of stimulation of the subgenual cingulate. I've added a couple of quotes there. "The blanket over me got lighter, and there was a disappearance of the void." These are people who are profoundly depressed and who feel a lifting of that depression just by virtue of very low levels of brain stimulation in the subgenual cingulate. All of which suggests that there's something about the experience of emotion, not telling whether a face is happy or sad, but the feeling of being happy or sad, which is run by subcortical brain areas. So should we try the next slide? What we also know, and this is some more papers that we've published over the years, that the cortex is not involved in the core experience of emotions. So it more or less doesn't matter which cortical brain area you damage. These patients are always unchanged in their ability to experience emotion. Now, they can't manage emotions well, but that's a different story. The experience of emotion is intact. So let's try the next slide, and we'll see a little bit more about that. Here's some imaging work by Tony Damasio. Again, it's a little old now, but it's a very good study comparing a control condition with experience of emotions in the scanner. Damasio, critically in this experiment, isn't asking you to look at happy or sad faces. He finds participants who can remember happy or sad experiences, and they run through them in their minds in the scanner, thinking, "Yes, I remember that time where my girlfriend rejected me, and I really loved her, and I feel so sad now. My life's never going to be the same." There were people who were good at this sort of skill. In fact, there were several reports in the method section of people crying in the scanner during the sadness condition. So there's something effective about it. And as you can see in the bottom part of each of those slides, let's look at the sadness condition top left. In red, you can see activation when you subtract that from the control condition, activation of these subcortical brain areas bilaterally. They run from upper brainstem through the hypothalamus towards areas like, for example, the anterior cingulate, which we now know are at the heart of these basic emotional experiences. So if we can try the next slide. And we also know, and this is some of the work that I did with Christian, my Chilean colleague, demonstrating how best to elicit these emotions. So we're trying to stop people just showing happy or sad faces, or indeed showing people video clips of films you've never heard of. And we ask people to have a recall of personal life stories. So we encourage them to remember something that made you feel sad. Tell me more about that. And then, in the next minute, we move on to tell me something that made you feel angry, and so on. So it's eliciting the correct kind of emotion the correct way is really important methodologically. So, okay, next slide, please. Okay, so let me summarize that first bit, which is that I think most people in our field agree on the following principles. Not everybody, but there we go. That there are a small number of basic emotions. It would be a 1-hour lecture only on how many basic emotions there are, but somewhere between 4 and 7. They are run by subcortical structures, probably the oldest of which is in the upper brainstem. It's the periaqueductal gray, the gray matter around the cerebral aqueduct in the midbrain. But other areas like the hypothalamus and amygdala. And the purpose of these areas is motivational. It makes us feel powerful emotions which drive us to do things. It's the source of energy in our lives that helps us to decide what's important and what's not. And this is a terrible summary of some huge literature, but this seems to be shared in common across all human societies. So, not only Western countries, not only people who are educated, across the world, including people who haven't had formal education, seem to experience these basic emotions. It's true across historical time periods. So people have been having happy and sad feelings for a very long time. You only have to watch any of the plays of, William Shakespeare, or anybody else who's been describing these things for a long time, all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you'll see those experiences. They occur even in human beings whose intelligence is very limited, like the newborn infant or adults with dementia, for example. And these basic emotions are also experienced in non-human animals, especially mammals, but many other non-human animals. And I've got a nice review paper that came out a few years ago on that topic. So this is what we think the basics of emotional experience is. It's subcortical, old, and very powerful. So let's keep going then. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about emotion regulation now, which is not run by old subcortical areas, but run by new cortical areas. And next slide, let's see if we can find out a bit more about that. So emotion regulation was very badly understudied for many years. The graph you can see in the top is citations using the word emotion regulation. When we started our work, Christian and I, my field on the brain basis of emotion regulation was publishing 1.5 papers a year, something as important as how we manage our feelings. And my field could only manage between 1 and 2 papers, per annum on it. It's compared with the number of papers on cognitive topics like, visuospatial abilities or language, it's just laughable. So we've tried to change that and build some studies on the brain basis of emotion regulation. And on the next slide, I'll show you some examples. Next slide, please. So here's one cognitive skill which is running emotion regulation. It's the idea about suppressing emotions or amplifying emotions. People get videoed while they're having an emotional experience. We study patients who have focal brain lesions in the frontal lobes in particular, in order to see what the brain basis is. And the next slide, if you can show that to us, you'll see the brain basis for this task of emotion suppression or amplification. And here's the effect. It's a right lateralized skill. It involves the frontal lobes, and it especially seems to involve the anterior parts of the insula. So, of course, there are some patients who lose this ability. Phineas Gage type examples spring to mind, and they, of course, become disinhibited because they can't contain or manage their, these very powerful feelings. And notice that this is not a language-based emotion regulation skill, and it's right lateralized. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll give you a second example, a different skill. This one is called reappraisal, and the skill here is to take something bad that's happened to you and think about something positive in relation to it. The example I like to choose is rejection. So you could have been rejected by somebody romantically, But are you able to think about something positive in relation to that, even though you've just been dumped? And the answers we get from people typically are things like, do you know what, my friends always told me they were an idiot, and I finally realized that. Or to be honest, I had enough of them anyway. And actually, now I've just, found my first love from secondary school on Facebook, and maybe I'll go and send her an email. There are lots of things you can do, but you can imagine ways in which positives can be taken from something as bad as rejection. And reappraisal asks you to do that, but this time verbally. And again, we study patients with focal brain lesions. There's the example with a scan over there. And we find some people who can't, and they tend to have left lateralized lesions rather than right in the last example. We're also able to see which psychological processes underpin the skill, and they are inhibition and verbal fluency. So we think what happens is that if you can't manage your feelings, you become overwhelmed by them, and you start, for example, to ruminate. So you get depressed, and you keep cycling through these thoughts about how bad your life is, and you can't get yourself out of it. But if you have executive function skills, you can temporarily inhibit that feeling of sadness. That's using the inhibition skill. And then with your verbal fluency, with your linguistic ability, you can build a little bandage to protect yourself. And the bandage are thoughts like, they were an idiot anyway. My friends had always been telling me that they were a mistake. Or, maybe I'll find somebody else more interesting. And then, of course, you don't have to inhibit it anymore. You can let it go because you have used your linguistic abilities to protect yourself. That's at least how we think reappraisal works. And if we can go to the next slide, I'll show you a more concrete example of that. So this is a patient that we report in the 2014 paper, who's seen in psychotherapy. He has some left lateralized lesions. He has a bit of hemiparesis on his right side, and he has big problems with rumination. So here's his description of his life. Having difficulties walking is something that saddens me. But then I have this experience that, well, I know it's okay to feel sad, but this is not just feeling sad. This is like, and he uses a beautiful phrase here, it's like a sticky sadness, which makes me feel sadder than I should. And then he gives us an analogy. He says it's like when you step in the mud and you can't pull your foot out easily of the mud. He can't get rid of these sad feelings. He then carries on, I don't think it's on the next slide, talking about how no, it's not. Okay, we'll have to go back to the last one for a second. He talks about how his wife can act as an external agent in this, and she can reappraise for him, but he's unable to do this on his own. Okay, so that's my second point then, which is that the experience of emotion is subcortical and very old, but the ability to manage our feelings is probably run by the cerebral cortex, and especially by executive abilities in the frontal lobes, which clearly has very big implications because emotion regulation is one of the great success stories of human civilization. People talk all the time about how good we are at language and problem solving, but managing our feelings is the only thing that stops our primate bodies from getting very frustrated by living in cities with 1 million other people. So, it's and getting on hot trains when it's too hot, and having frustration experiences, but you manage them. You don't allow yourself to act on those strong feelings. And indeed, if you did, you would be setting yourself for a classification on the DSM. Okay, so I've showed you the fundamentals of emotion now. The experience is subcortical. The management of the skill is cortical. But we could also ask the question, are there any cognitive abilities which aren't really necessary in relation to emotion? And I'm interested in emotion and psychotherapy. So I convinced a PhD student of mine who's on the next slide, or maybe not quite on the next slide yet. Let's talk about multiple memory systems. So we've known, of course, really since the middle of the last century, that the brain runs multiple memory systems, probably 5 or 6 different systems in parallel. The famous ones are episodic memory, for example, or semantic memory. But it seems as if we also have emotion-related memory systems. And here's a famous experiment, 100 years old now, by Edward Claparade, with a patient who's amnesic. And by amnesic, I mean they have a loss of the ability to form episodic memories. So they can't consciously remember what happened a minute ago. Claparade famously meets the patient every morning on his ward rounds, and then in an experiment that you wouldn't get ethics approval for these days, he hides a pin, a safety pin in his hand, and then stabs the patient when he shakes hands with her. The question is what happens a day later when he comes back on his next ward round, and he tries to shake her hand, but she refuses. She doesn't remember him, but she knows there's something about him that feels bad. In fact, she has a rationalization, I think, and says, surely a lady has the right not to shake a gentleman's hand. So she doesn't know why she doesn't like him, but she knows she doesn't like him. There have been a number of experiments, including some in our lab, demonstrating this in amnesic patients, suggesting that this thing we call emotion-based learning, emotional memories, is preserved in patients with, for example, medial temporal lobe lesions. So the next slide, if you can go to it, shows us a little bit of the anatomy of that. The picture in the middle, of course, is the classical medial temporal structures that run episodic memory. The picture on the left-hand side shows a primitive attempt at identifying the brain areas that underpin emotional memory, which are very different from classic episodic memory. And these are the sorts of patients that we've studied in the scan on the right-hand side. For example, with a left posterior cerebral artery infarction, which makes these patients amnesic. The question is emotion memory preserved? And we've published a couple of papers on that topic, including in Alzheimer's disease. So the next slide, please. So here's some work with Catherine Evans, now Catherine Evans-Roberts, showing that these patients can learn emotion-related things. This is the famous Iowa gambling task, in which the patient shows preserved abilities to learn, quite the same as controls, even though he can't remember anything that happened 2 minutes earlier. The next slide, please. So I then convinced a colleague of mine, Paul Moore, who's in this picture over here, my PhD student, who's a psychotherapist, to take 2 profoundly amnesic patients into psychotherapy, in one case for 2 years, and in the other case for 18 months. He's very heroic to do it. How do you do psychotherapy with someone who can't remember what happened to you 2 minutes ago? And we demonstrate in 2 papers that I've got at the bottom there, that these patients can still develop a working relationship with their therapist, the transference relationship people would normally call it. By the way, they use the therapist as some sort of external memory aid, which is quite interesting because they know they're amnesic. And the care staff who look after these patients report improvements. That is, that they're less frustrated and irritable, and the care staff find them easier to manage, which I think is an important finding. So if you can go to the next slide, I think that might be the last of those. Okay, so important for me to demonstrate that I'm not claiming that you need all your brain to manage psychotherapy. You probably need executive function to manage it, but probably not some other skills. And I think that's it's important for us to understand the architecture of emotion. My 4th point then is that feelings which are badly regulated or unregulated seem to lead to people believing things that aren't true, delusional or false beliefs. So can we try the next slide? We're interested here in patients who have damage to medial frontal cortex, and we think disruptions of emotional regulation. And we demonstrated, I suppose, 20 years ago now, that these patients show a strong positive bias in their delusional beliefs. That is, they believe things that are not only false, but make their lives more tolerable, almost as if they have a choice between an unpleasant reality and a pleasant delusion, and they choose the delusion. We think, by the way, that it's an extreme clinical example of what, of course, we sometimes see in our everyday lives in people who hold those opinions. I notice, for example, some politicians seem incapable, even some American presidents seem incapable of believing that they aren't perfect. They externalize the problems on everybody else. They themselves are flawless, and they have exactly the same sort of prejudice in terms of the emotional consequences of their ideas as we get in these patients. So if you can go to the next slide, I think I might be able to show you an example of that. This is a patient who shows those sorts of positive delusional beliefs. Can we try the next slide, and I'll see if I've got an example here for us. Okay, so I'm going to read a story out to you, and then we're going to see some people reporting on it. So you try to remember the story if you can. You're a hardworking employee. It is Sunday morning and you're preparing to go out. You're planning a wonderful trip by the seaside to rest, but your best friend calls you and says that they are ill and lonely and needs your help. You're exhausted, but you don't want to miss your trip, so you lie to them, saying that you promised to go and see a family member. 4 days later, you find that due to inappropriate treatment, your friend's health has severely deteriorated. You feel guilty and ashamed of yourself. So hopefully, firstly, it's an emotional story. I hope you agree. And hopefully you remember some of the details. The two main things are the facts of the story, you know, the days that it happens on and that you lied and that you feel guilty later, which is the other element. So the facts, and let's look at the emotional consequences. And we'll try 3 people. The next slide, please. So here's a neurologically normal control who performs the way you and I would if we had to do this. And they get the facts right and they get the emotion right. I'm a dedicated employee sitting on a Sunday morning, looking forward to a day trip to the seaside. My friend calls me to say that they're ill and lonely. No, I explain. No, actually, I don't explain how tired I am. I make up an excuse that I have to see my family. And then 4 days later, my friend's health has deteriorated due to inappropriate treatment. And I feel guilty and I can't remember what else it is. So that's about 60% or so of the story, which is great. And also, it describes accurately the feeling of guilt in relation to this. So let's try the next slide, which is an amnesic patient. And here's what the amnesic patient says. They remember almost nothing. They say, he made an excuse that he was on holiday and his friend died. Oh, yes, and I felt ashamed. So the slides belong to a paper in which we did this sort of work with a much larger group of Korsakoff's patients. But notice 2 aspects of this patient's performance. They don't remember very much, and some of their detail is inaccurate, like the death of the friend who doesn't die, of course, in the story. But I do remember that there's an excuse made or a lie, but also it's emotionally accurate. They remember that they felt ashamed, which I think is interesting. So the last is going to be the group of confabulating patients that we have an example for, which I find particularly interesting and actually amusing. So can we go next slide, please, if we could. Okay, so here's the confabulating patient with the same story. You're going to see your sister on the coast. You felt you needed a rehab visit to get yourself totted up again. A friend rings. He feels ill, getting worse. He needs a bit of help. Would you like to go and talk to him to cheer him up, put him straight, whatever? You do that. You go down, you do that. It was a Monday or something like that. By the Friday, the medical people realize that they've been giving him the wrong treatment and his condition has deteriorated considerably. But you feel happy that you've been down to help on time. So notice that this is quite a good recall of the facts of the story, much better than the amnesic patient, but it's emotionally completely inaccurate. Instead of feeling guilty that you lied to your friend and therefore that they got ill, instead, you're the good guy in the story. You know, you've been down to sort the problem out and everything's going to be really great. You know, only I can save America, say some presidential candidates, you know. So I think it's an excellent example of this positive bias in the way in which the emotional consequences of feelings are, are shaped. So let's go to the next slide if we can. Well, I suppose it's just saying that same thing. Basically, these patients are emotionally accurate when they're talking about other people's feelings, and when they're talking, or actions, when they're talking about their own actions, they're accurate if it's positive. There's only one category in which they make mistakes, and which is when it's about me and when it's bad. And suddenly they seem to have a memory lapse in relation to that, and distort the stories, which I think is interesting in relation to narcissism. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, which is I think the last of what category I'd like to talk about, rehabilitation. So the next slide again, please. As I said, I work for the North Wales Brain Injury Service, and most family and patient complaints are about their emotional lives, about their husband that gets too angry, about the fact that they're too afraid to go shopping, but actually most of our interventions in neurorehabilitation are cognitive rather than emotional. So we've tried very much to avoid that. We run a rural service. I live here in not a densely populated part of the UK, and we run lifelong interventions for these people. We don't treat them acutely and then send them away. We send them away and tell them you can come to us when you need help. It's a sort of community long-term rehabilitation approach, which is we find has been helpful. So, and there's a paper about our unit. The next slide, please. I published a little book with Christian and my other clinical friend Rudy Kutzer, in case you're interested in it, called Mistakes in Clinical Neuropsychology. It's aimed at trainees. If anyone is interested in clinical neuropsychology, we describe 14 of our best mistakes, or our worst mistakes, I suppose you could call it, using sort of Oliver Sacks style stories. And there's lots of stuff in there in relation to emotion. So the next slide, if we could. So this is Leanne Rowlands, who was also my PhD student. And with her, we developed an emotion regulation program that we deliver in our brain injury service. And we demonstrate that the therapeutic alliance, which people often talk about, is useful, but it's not the best predictor of outcome. And that our work in groups, we tend to aim for 7 to 8 people in a group, is what's most appreciated by our patients. So I didn't used to believe in group therapy, but now I'm a big convert. Of course, it saves money because you get to deliver it more at scale. But I would do it now, even if it didn't save money. These patients really benefit from being guided through a program that helps them to understand their problems in the light of other patients with acquired brain injury. And the next slide, we're nearly at the end. We also demonstrate that there are some pessimists out there who think that if patients have cognitive impairment, then they're not very good they're not suitable candidates for neuro rehab. We demonstrated that that's definitely not the case. You just need to change your approach. And 2 chapters in the book called Thinking Inside the Box and Concrete Patients Need Concrete Therapists cover exactly this issue, demonstrating how we need to be inclusive of our patients who need rehabilitation after brain injury, not finding reasons to exclude them. And the next slide, maybe the last. Okay, so that's my summary. I've lived in a time, thank heavens, it's been an honor to work in a time in which neuropsychology has started to understand the importance of emotion and its brain basis. And it's been a privilege to be a part of that journey. We also hope you can see that emotion is not just about feelings itself, but because feelings are so ancient, they have implications for all other aspects of cognition, all the clever parts of the mind. We have emotion in decision-making, in delusional beliefs, in memory, and of course we have new systems for how we might manage emotions. And this has some very important implications, for example, for the neuroscience of psychotherapy, which I'm interested in, and also, of course, for the links between neuroscience and neurology and indeed psychiatry. So on that front, I hope I haven't taken too much of your time, my friends. I'm happy to stop there and take any questions if you have them.
Thank you very much, Professor. Amazing lecture. I will call to the table my friends. Let's see here. Dr. José Aparecido. You knew before. And Dr. Renato Leonardo. Let's see here. Let's see. Dr. José Aparecido and Leonardo. So thank you again very much. I will talk just a moment in Portuguese to the audience and then we come back. Pessoal, então a gente vai fazer agora um debate e perguntas com o professor e daí a gente vai ver se pega algumas questões também de vocês aqui. Eu vi que o pessoal estava querendo negócio do WhatsApp, não sei o quê. Depois da aula, eu vou com calma e coloco na descrição do vídeo, tá, pessoal? Senão, na próxima aula, eu jogo também pro pessoal. É que como esse vídeo, nós tivemos problema com a apresentação do professor e eu estava passando o slide para ele, a gente não conseguiu ter essa interação toda e o Renato segurou o pepino bacana aí. Então, muito obrigado ao Renato também por isso. Então, vamos lá. Professor, to start the questions, about the lecture, we have a very usual question of the students during our course. Every time we talk about emotions, face recognition. Yesterday we had a lecture of face recognition. Always they asking us about what's the difference between emotion and feelings. Is it possible to separate?
Yep. I teach an undergraduate lecture on this very topic. So I think the usual way my field looks at it is that emotion has multiple manifestations, maybe 5 or 6 different manifestations. Some of them are physiological, like the change in your heart rate, you know, and your hair becomes erect and, you know, you sweat and so on. Some of them are in your facial expressions. We talked about that earlier. Some are in bodily changes, you know, the way in which you might feel, you know, physically angry. And one component of them is the subjective experience of the emotion, and for which we tend to use the word affect rather than emotion. So, you know, what it feels like to be sad or happy. So I would regard the subjective experience of emotion as one of, you know, maybe half a dozen different manifestations of emotion. That would be my simple summary.
Okay. Professor José Aparecido, Professor Leonardo, please. Professor José Aparecido is with the Aula.
Renato, you can make the question, please.
Your microphone.
Oh, my God. Nice to meet you, Professor Oliver. Simone make the question. She wants to know the relationship between pain and emotion.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a complex question. Again, I have an undergraduate lecture on it. I will try to summarize it in 2 minutes. The question of how we classify emotions, what is the taxonomy of emotions? The view that I belong to is that they can be viewed in 3 layers. Okay. And the first layer are what we could call sensory affects. And these are things very directed to bodily feelings. They are temporary and they're quite specific. So pain would be an example, but I could have chosen hunger or anger or what do they call it? Air hunger. Lots of different feelings that we can have, like this thirst. So pain is one of those. And anatomically, these belong lower down in the brainstem. Then we have the main group earlier that we call the basic emotions, for which we think there are 4 to 7. Things like happiness, sadness, and anger. They are not tied to specific stimuli. So there are lots of things that can make me angry, but there's only one thing that can make me hungry, and that's not having food. And also hunger, it's very easy to get rid of. You just have some food and then it goes away. But these basic emotions apply to multiple objects in the world, and they fluctuate gradually, rather than having an on-off state. But they're still primitive. So we think the newborn child is born with these basic emotions. Then above the basic emotions, the third classification are the cognitive or tertiary emotions, and they are more complicated. They need more cleverness. Examples might be guilt, or shame. Shame is sadness, because obviously when I'm ashamed, I feel sad. I feel that I've lost your affection because of what I did. But it needs more cognitive skill. I have to remember which thing it was that I did that was shameful, and I have to have enough empathy that I can understand your feelings, in order to understand that I should feel guilty. So I don't think, newborn children are not feeling shame or guilt. They're just feeling sadness. And that system is much more cognitive. We know something of the brain basis of empathy, which is a medial frontal skill, if it's anything. So, obviously the taxonomy of emotions is a complicated topic, but my guess is 3 layers: basic sensory affect, then basic emotions, and then on top of that, these more complex tertiary emotions like guilt or jealousy. There's another good one for you. I hope that's a reasonable summary. It's a complicated question.
Okay.
Thank you.
We have this question from the audience about, since we know the stimulus in the future, would it be possible to use a brain chip capable to influence the emotion?
So I don't think a chip is the answer, but you never know. The world changes very fast, doesn't it? But the work of Helen Mayberg that I described earlier looks a little bit like that. So that is deep brain stimulation, which is a technology that already exists for Parkinson's disease. With the ability, because they can be controlled, at a distance. At the moment, when last I saw Helen's work, they were just turning it on and leaving it on at a particular level. But I could imagine a world in which it fluctuated, based on, maybe you could change it, or who knows, in the future, maybe some AI of yours is going to learn based on, some other physiological measures that you have and do the changing for you. So I think it is likely. But I don't think it will replace the psychotherapies in the same way that I don't think the pharmacotherapies replace the psychotherapies, because all of the evidence with psychotherapy and pharmacotherapy is that both are better than either alone. So my guess is it's a third technology which we can use, and it will be the job of your psychiatrist to work out what sort of intervention you would have. And if I had money, then and it was a family member of mine, I would try all 3 of them. Because all of them are reversible now. Pharmacotherapy, you can stop taking it, and you can leave psychotherapy, and with deep brain stimulation, you can turn it off. So anyway, yeah, I think it's a very good question. Thank you.
Yeah, we have another question from Wilson Jr. He asking you about the most significant challenges in psychotherapy process when working with people who have memory impairment, profound episodic memory impairment.
Well, I would recommend that you had a look at the paper. I think the obvious challenge is that they can't remember. So Paul, who did the work, found these patients a bit boring because they tell you the same stories. You know, they've got a narrative, and they don't remember that they've told you this anecdote. So you get to hear the same stories over and over again. They come out slightly differently, and we're doing some work at the moment analyzing the sessions around that. But that's one of the challenges. A second challenge, I think, is the counter-transference, if I can use that psychotherapy phrase. You know, your feelings about the patient. Because if a patient tells you something boring, then you get frustrated with them. And it's a challenge for you as a therapist, because you need to be able to listen properly. Also, you know, because these patients have acquired brain injury, and any of us could have an acquired brain injury tomorrow morning, all you've got to do is have a car accident or a blood clot, and you are one of my patients, you know, or I am one of my patients. I think Paul found that quite challenging as well. You know, he was comparing with their lives. But the one we talk about the most in the paper is the process of ending the therapy, the termination phase. Because normally you decide our sessions are going to end at the end of September, and we've got 5 weeks to work through, you know, all the issues. But our patient doesn't know that because he's amnesic. So Paul found it very difficult. He wanted to try to bring closure, but couldn't. And interestingly, we find in the transcripts that although the patient's not consciously reporting end of sessions, they do seem to raise more issues about separation and loss and about reunion and return in those later sessions, as if they do sort of know, or the emotion memory system knows, but the episodic memory system doesn't. So I'd highly recommend looking at Paul's papers. That they make very interesting reading.
Okay, we have some more couple of questions here. One of them, people often express very emotional experience in terms of intensity. How the new developments involved research using neuroimaging can tell us about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the one issue I would say is it's quite hard to elicit very powerful emotions in an experimental setting. You know, you really start to experience ethical challenges of, you know, you can't frighten people, you know, a bit like that. And that's why we've done work with people with brain lesions. You know, we have one patient whose paper we've almost sent off now, who had a lot of memories of sexual abuse in her earlier years that she had managed to successfully repress. And after her brain injury, she stopped being able to repress them. These things came back. So, you know, she wasn't able to protect herself well anymore because of the emotion regulation issues. Imaging challenges. The other issue I find with psychotherapy for imaging is that they tend to use a before-after paradigm. So you test my spider phobia now, then you give me 8 weeks of desensitization therapy, then you test my spider phobia again. And there's a lot that's happened in those 8 weeks. So it's lots of brain areas light up as having changed, but it is sometimes difficult to interpret what the reasons are for the change. But of course, you know, no doubt technologies will improve with time. So I'd be interested to see what happens to it all.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question.
We have one more from Elder Felix. Excellent lecture, Professor. I've seen patients with brain tumors in subcortical regions, and they often complain of emotional problems like depression, psychic, suffering associated with amygdala. Is there any relationship between amygdala size or amygdala lesion? Okay, but amygdala size with some psychiatric or psychopathy?
Yeah, I mean there are some papers on the topic which show weak correlations between those things. The main thing I would say is that the amygdala doesn't seem to have its biggest role in emotion regulation, but more of a role in emotion memory. So it's the thing that helps us to remember what the anxious making event was, and we don't know enough about which brain lesions disrupt emotion regulation, but that's it's a pretty common complaint after various forms of brain injury, and it's more, I think, than just the fact that they've had a brain injury. You know, it's in the way that you could have a shoulder injury or a leg injury. You know, it's it seems to in many cases disrupt the ability to manage their feelings. But we have had some success in treating those patients. They just need, for example, to be aware of their emotions at a lower state. We work very hard on emotion awareness in our patients. For example, the angry patients don't realize that they're getting angry until they lose their temper. So one of our sessions is about realizing when you've become a little bit irritated and realizing that you can leave the room. You can say, I'm finding this all a bit too much. I'm going to go for a walk in the garden for half an hour. And those are very simple interventions, but we find them very effective with our patients. But they haven't realized how simple they are. There's also we use a tool, the fancy name for which is situation select, which basically means don't go to places that make you unhappy. You know, our patients, for example, find shops confusing, too many things, you know, too many people. So you can make some choices. You can make sure you write a list before you go to the shops. You can make sure you go to the shops in the middle of the day. Go at night when nobody else is there. You know, you can go shopping with a friend. You know, they need to make decisions which are simple strategies, but will help them if they start to implement them. You know, we remember I talked about one of the chapters in our book, which is concrete patients need concrete therapists.
Yeah.
A lot of the stuff we do is not fancy. It's not abstract interpretations in psychotherapy. It's simple tools that our patients can use to make their lives better. So thank you for the question.
Yeah. My last question before we go to finish is, we lived some years ago the pandemics, COVID-19, yeah, and many people is suffered by memory losses, emotional problems. How is your experience with these patients in United Kingdom, and what you can talk about this?
Yeah, so I don't know very much about you know, neurology and COVID-19. We did host a little conference here in the middle of the pandemic about it. The presentations seem very variable, but if there's one a symptom that sticks out above all else, it's the thing that looks like chronic fatigue. You know, and we've had chronic fatigue, myalgic encephalomyelitis. It's had many names over the years. You know, seem to be the most common of the complaints in that patient group. I don't know its neural basis, but I do know that the strange disease encephalitis lethargica that happened after the First World War, I don't know if people remember the Oliver Sacks book, Awakenings, selectively disrupted the dopamine-producing areas in the upper brainstem, in the ventral tegmentum. And those patients had major losses of initiative for many decades. In fact, they were eventually treated with L-Dopa by Sacks in the 1960s. So I don't know enough about the neurology of it, but I do know that seemed to me the most common of the symptoms. So I'm afraid I'm no COVID expert.
Okay.
Hope we don't get another one.
Okay. So, what is better for us? Friends, pets, or social network?
So what were the three choices?
What is better for our emotional things? Pets, animals, friends, or social network?
Well, definitely not social networks. They selectively try to make your life less happy. You only have to look at the graphs of teenage happiness since 2013, and they take off. I've spent a bit of time surveying the positive psychology literature that's Marty Seligman started 30 years ago. And in my summary of that literature, there are 4 things that are good for your happiness, and one of them is not money. So it seemed they've come with different names over the years, but here's my summary. The first one used to be called marriage, but you don't have to be married. It's having a long-term stable relationship with someone you get on with, number 1. Number 2 is the strength of your wider social networks. So you don't want to have everything invested in your spouse. It's quite good if you are doing lots of other different things and you're part of a lot of networks. All of your eggs are not in one basket is the important thing. And you're not going to get lonely if you're full of part of lots of social networks. Third element is a sense of control. So you want to live a world in which you get to choose what you're going to do every day. It's not that somebody else is going to decide and you just have to implement it. You want to have a set of choices, and there are some countries' political systems that are much better for that than others, which is why some of the Scandinavian countries do very well on those happiness scales. And the fourth one used to be called religion. Then they renamed it spirituality, and now they've renamed it meaning. And it's very individual here, but it's the sense that you are part of a journey with other people about something that is more important than just your life. And it will take you your whole life to do it, and it's big and it's important. What is meaningful to me may not be meaningful to you. It has to be individually constructed, but it's a sense of purpose that you're part of something big and important, and people who have that, it does. I'm an atheist, so it's not God in my case, but obviously there are some people for whom that works. But there are lots of other things that are meaningful. Those seem to me, on my reading of the literature, to be the 4 best predictors. Money doesn't count, health even doesn't count. The weather doesn't count. All sorts of things that people think is important, they wear off. Winning the lottery doesn't count. It's good for about a year, but in the end, it doesn't make you any happy, especially if you move out of your neighborhood and you lose all of your social networks and you go and live with some rich people who look down on you all the time. So my advice to somebody is if you win the lottery, is don't tell anybody.
Yeah.
Spend the money slowly on a few things that will make you and your family happier.
Okay.
Anyway, there we go.
Yeah. So, Professor Oliver Turnbull, thank you again for this pleasant lecture. We are really very happy to have you here and to share with you this moment with questions and many knowledge about emotions in our course. Thank you very much.
That's great.
Sorry.
I was going to say, it's a pleasure to be here, and you feel free to share my slides. I don't mind if you make them available to the group.
Yes. In the end of our course, we think to publish a volume of summaries of each class, and then we will invite you to share with us a summary of this class.
That would be great. I'd be very happy to. Well, thank you very much. It's been very nice to meet you, and my best wishes to all the people of Brazil. Good luck with your work.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
everyone. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.